Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's part 2. Welcome back. So, if you didn't see part 1, there's the link in the description down below. So, in part 1, we discussed basically how gravity works and which orbits it can predict. It means circular, a linear, parabolic, an elliptical, and so on. And even we saw a little bit about how Einstein viewed this so-called gravity. But now, this part 2 is the effects of gravity. And the greatest effect of gravity we have seen is so-called tides. So for those who live in coastal regions, you have noticed that the water gets closer then recedes. Oh, just take a look at this little clip and you'll understand what I mean. Around 9 a.m. in the morning, there is a low tide at this beach, so the water levels are still very far from the beach surface. So that's a low tide. But now take a look later during the day. Aha! You see? This is the same spot later during the day, showing that the water levels have risen. Thus, it is a high tide. Okay, let's envision these two rocks as the Earth and the Moon. This one is much less massive than this one. Okay, these are not to scale. The Moon is much smaller than that compared to the Earth, but let's just go with it. The Moon is orbiting the Earth. But remember, the Moon is pulling on the Earth, but the Earth is also pulling on the Moon. So this creates what we call tides. They're basically stretching each other. So there is the force of gravity pulling the Earth toward the Moon, but there is also the force of inertia trying to resist the motion of gravity. So we have a tide here and a tide there. So the tide here on this part facing the Moon is called a high tide. That's when the water levels rose. But this part is called the low tide. This is where the water levels are still decreasing and very low. That's basically it. And remember, the Earth is also rotating on its axis. Remember? So the bulge is basically not moving. So the Earth is rotating within the bulge. And that's why we have 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. That's basically it. The Earth is basically rotating within the tidal bulge. That's basically the shape of this so-called tide effect. So check this little simulation out. It will show you basically much better than this model of the rocks how basically the tidal bulge is formed and how rotation and the movement of the Moon basically affects how this tidal bulge evolves. The tidal bulge does not move, but the Earth is rotating within the bulge. That creates the tides. Tides do not occur only in the Earth-Moon system. They occur everywhere. So when you're standing next to a person, you're basically pulling and stretching each other by nanometers, very small lengths. But in order to see the real power of these tides, we have to look at the planetary scale, like the Earth-Moon system. Even the sun affects the tides. There's the spring and neap tides due to the sun. We'll discuss them way later because they are much more complicated. But even when we look at pictures of galaxies like this one, the galaxies are basically tearing each other apart. They're basically stretching each other like taffy. When objects are near black holes, they're basically stretched out into spaghetti-shaped objects. That's basically spaghettification. That's the extremity of tides at its best. So tides are everywhere. They affect stars, they affect galaxies, they affect people. They affect even our holidays when we go to the beach. They are, when tides are very extreme, you can see sometimes floodings near the coast and so on. This just gives you the real power of tides. So those are basically the effects of gravity. They can build planets, stars, comets, even the sun was built by gravity, but they can also rip everything apart. Neutron stars and black holes. So we'll discuss all those very those objects with strong gravitational fields. They will have their very own episodes, and how the tides are affecting the solar system. We'll discuss this much later. And remember, if you haven't understand this yet, just slow down. That's the good thing about YouTube. You can go and slow down the speed, you can go back up, you can rewind, and basically see again what I am explaining. So remember, if you haven't seen part 1, you cannot very well understand this. So go back to part 1 if you haven't seen it. There's the link in the description. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, I hope you like this video. Remember to click the like button and subscribe and share with your friends. Remember also to support me on my Patreon page. So, thank you. See you on the next episode.